Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, assigned here at the National Conservation Training Center. And in a minute, we're going to share with you a wonderful public lecture by Jeffrey Ryan talking about his newest book, This Land Was Saved for You and Me, How Gifford, Pinchot, Frederick Law Olmsted, and a band of foresters rescued America's public lands. After his public lecture, you'll also see a little added bonus content for this online version where we talk about some of Jeffrey's other works. And those who haven't heard Jeffrey speak before, he is a storyteller, a historian, a photographer, a great hiker, and he spins a wonderful yarn about the Appalachian Trail, about the creation of America's public lands, and the connection between early conservationists. So enjoy.
Thank you, Mark. It's always great to be here. I love this place. It's like my own personal Woodstock, I think. I'm really excited about this book. I think this is number 6 for me, but in the back of my mind for several years, I've been sort of fomenting this idea of, it started with a search for following the path of the founders of the Wilderness Society, and it kind of morphed into something bigger and better, I think, at least for this go-round. Quite a story. For me, as Mark said, personally, I started this journey quite literally by hiking from Mexico to Canada when I was 26 years old. And this is me with my 6-month beard, I think, on the Pacific Crest Trail in 1983. And if nothing gives you an appreciation for wild lands and the people who made them possible, there's nothing like traveling at 3 miles an hour for 6.5 months and really understanding that we can't take these places for granted. So after I came back from my long one-shot hike, I started doing something a little different, which was section hiking the Appalachian Trail, which I did over 28 years with the same friend. And we would literally take a little piece and do it every year. And it was 1985 to 2013 that we did that. And it led to the creation of my first book, Appalachian Odyssey, a 28-year hike on America's Trail. And while I was doing that book, which was largely a memoir, each chapter was about each of 28 separate trips. I started really digging deeper into the history of the Appalachian Trail. Who were the people that made it possible, which led me to my second book called Blazing Ahead. So now I'd had this nice montage of personal experience and historical deep dives, and I just kept going down that path. As Mark said, I'm really taken by what formed the ideas to establish wilderness areas, conservation areas, national forests, and what made these people become the great champions that they were. That became my next driving force in my life. And so I started literally traveling to the places where these folks lived and were their upbringings were had, and their parents sort of gave them their own perspectives as well. And I was always trying to figure out, is it a combination? Is it one more than the other, environment or physical environment or fostering environment by the people who mentor people? So it ended up taking me to Ernest Oberholzer's island twice near Rainy Lake, Minnesota. There's Ernest in his cabin there. And also, of course, led me to Aldo Leopold's both birthplace in Burlington, Iowa, but also in his shack in Wisconsin, which I visited. And of course, we all know, most of us know, what a force Aldo was in terms of both land preservation, conservation, and restoration. And then finally, it brought me a little bit closer to home here just north of here in Milford, Pennsylvania, where Gifford Pinchot was raised and learned about the importance of forestry and sustainable forests. So after doing all these deep dives into these people, our heroes, I started coming up with this idea of developing a conservation family tree. And what happened was the roots started getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and I realized that there were so many overlapping people and places and events that it became way too complex for me to take on. I think I'd need a supercomputer to do it. I sort of likened it to Spock playing three-dimensional chess. So what I ended up doing was I had an insight that there were really three major handoffs from the time when Frederick Olmsted designed Central Park all the way up through the signing of the Wilderness Act in 1964, which was just over 100 years. And so the conservation baton passes idea really became the backbone for this land was saved for you and me. And as I said, there were really three of them. The first was Olmsted, who quite literally passed the baton to Gifford Pinchot, and then from Gifford Pinchot to the young band of foresters who eventually rose up and realized that they needed to start a wilderness preservation system by law, by federal mandate, which led to the creation of the Wilderness Act. So I'm going to go back in time a little bit here with Olmsted, who I will just call Flo, because it saves me several syllables. Frederick Olmsted, whose 200th birthday was in fact this year. Olmsted was one of the people who was really informed by his environment more than anything. And even as an extremely young child, he was aware of the effect that scenery had on him. Those experiences only became punctuated by trips that his parents took him and his younger brother on through the wilds of Connecticut and beyond. But he always says that these trips gave him a bent for cultivated interest in scenery. Olmsted was born in Hartford, Connecticut, which was obviously very much more rural then than it is now. And he had relatives, the family had relatives within a 30-mile radius of their home. It was very rural. And what's really fascinating when we look at it in this day and age is that at the age of 8 years old, he and his younger 6-year-old brother would go on these hikes, and they'd go up to 15 miles a day, and they'd actually make a relative's house in 2 days, 30 miles, 8 years old and 6 years old. So they would get to a relative's house 30 miles from home, and they were walking through these beautiful landscapes, mostly farmlands and woodland paths. And of course, that had a very profound effect on young Flo. When he was 8 and his 9 and his brother was 7, their birth mother died, and his father remarried a woman named Mary Ann. And Mary Ann, much more so than his natural mother, his birth mother, was much more interested in these jaunts. So they would go all over New England and New York with the boys in tow. Just to give you an idea of how far afield they went, they got to Quebec, Niagara Falls, Franconia Notch, West Point, Connecticut Valley, and as Flo would later say, from the Kennebec River to the Naugatuck. One of the most profound places for him was seeing Niagara Falls for the first time. It always stuck in his head, and he would later on become a great advocate for Niagara Falls and its protection. Really interesting fact about Olmsted for what he ended up achieving in his life was he had almost no formal education. So the founder of landscape design, if you will, had almost no formal education. In fact, from ages 3 to 14, it was a mishmash of even to call it formal schooling is a bit of a lark. He was largely educated by pastors in the region who had different proficiencies. One of his biographers, Elizabeth Stevenson, indicates that he was almost an orphan boy. His parents, in particular his father, sent him off to these faraway places for schooling and almost had a standoffish relationship with him as far as education was concerned. This was really interesting because his younger brother ended up going to Yale. But as far as Flo was concerned, the father-child relationship was a little bit, go out and find your way on your own. But by the time he reached age 14, he was already setting his sights on Yale. Even so, it was derailed because he fell into a patch of poison ivy and had a really horrible reaction to the poison ivy that actually made his eyes swell shut. And he was in recovery for almost a year from that. So his college dreams were put on hold. At age 15, he was off living with another pastor, learning about surveying. And the reason why that was important is because surveying and that mindset came into play when he was designing parks later on, but still no formal schooling per se. At age 18, he decided maybe he should give Yale auditing classes at Yale a shot. He didn't like it. He railed against the formality of the educational structure. It was probably sitting in the classrooms. So he decided instead that he would become a deckhand and go to China and back. So I should mention now that he came from an affluent family. His father made a fortune in dry goods merchantry, and so Flo decides, I just want to go to China on this merchant marine ship. So he spends a year, and he spent long enough on the high seas to decide that he didn't want to do that anymore, and announced to his father that he would rather become a fruit farmer. And he thought that there would be an opportunity to sell fruit in New York City. So his father bought him a 125-acre farm with 100 acres of farmland and 25 acres of woodland. And what's neat about this is this was really his first foray into designing landscape. He was moving buildings, outbuildings to hide them from the farm, and he was building pathways and getting his feet wet with planting trees and living among formal and informal forest land. In 1855, another opportunity comes to him when his neighbor, Mr. Putnam, says that he wants to start a magazine to compete with Harper's Monthly. So he starts Putnam's monthly magazine and asks Fred if he would like to write for it. So now his career becomes writer. So if you're following along, he becomes a hiker, a surveyor, a fruit farmer, a merchant marine, and now he's getting into publishing. He borrows $5,000 from his dad. He goes to work in New York City, and his brother ends up staying on the farm because he's having health issues, so they make a big flip-flop. Flo goes to New York, but the loan has to be repaid. So then he starts writing books. He goes down south as a reporter for the New York Daily Times, which will become the New York Times, and writes a book about slavery. He becomes an abolitionist over time. He was philosophically on board with it, but he wasn't willing to take the plunge publicly, and he finally changed that attitude as he learned more and more about what was going on. He borrowed $500 more from his dad to get his first book printed, and it became a moderate success. And then he's about to publish his third book, and his brother John suddenly dies of tuberculosis. Shortly thereafter, Putnam's Monthly goes belly up, and now he owes another $8,000 to the publisher due to a court settlement. So now he's owing his father upwards of $10,000. Not a great place to be in the 1850s. So he's in this Connecticut hotel in 1857. He's going over the manuscript for a book that he just learned will never be published. He gets a telegram from his business partners saying 3 words: "We failed today." And he's sitting there wondering, what am I going to do? I now owe all this money. I don't even have a book to publish right now. And an old friend of his named Charles Eliot walks into the room and says, I'm on the board of a park in New York City, and we're desperately looking for a superintendent, and you should apply for it. So that's all it took. That night, Flo was on a ferry bound for New York City, and I think we know what the next chapter was. He became the co-designer of Central Park. He and a fellow named Calvert Vaux, who was schooled in cathedral design in Europe, became Olmsted's partner, and they proposed a new design for the park. The one that had been being worked on, the superintendents had already decided that that was not going to be the one. So they had a competition. Please design other ideas for the park. And Olmsted and Vaux became the winners with a plan called the Greensward Plan. And what was really cool about that was that Vaux handled all the structural parts of the park, the bridges, the boathouses, the pavilions, and everything. But Olmsted literally took care of all the rest, the areas of aesthetic distinction. The scenery theme comes back big time. Originally, it was going to be 750 acres. It expanded to 843. And so the construction of the park began in 1858. 5 million cubic yards of stone, earth, and topsoil were moved by hand. 36 bridges and arches designed by Vaux. They planted 500,000 trees. And again, the landscapes were entirely man-made. All the rolling hills and fields and landscapes. And the big part for Olmsted was the fact that they were bringing nature to people. And this was a really essential point for him. He was seeing an urban environment that was only getting more so by the day, and felt that providing trees and natural landscape was vital. The design of the park itself emphasized nature. It minimized the man-made. And he said in the proposal itself that freedom and repose, which will be refreshing and tranquilizing to the visitor coming from the confinement of and bustle of crowded streets. He wanted a refuge for people from their day-to-day lives, and finding it in nature was the best thing that we could do for them. So the 2 big takeaways from this project were, first of all, large projects were not daunting to Olmsted at all. And the second one was, he was an astounding visionary. He could look at a landscape and imagine what it was going to be like in 30, 40, 50 years. He was imagining the transition of the landscape so that he was designing it in from the get-go. But the second thing was, he could not only look at the landscape and see what was going to happen, he could look at the broader world and see what was going to happen. One great example of this was when he turned to Vaux, looking over all this dirt. I mean, it was nothing yet. And he said, someday this park will be surrounded by tall buildings. There were no tall buildings when he said it. He was very much aware that maybe not quite this, but something like it would overtake the landscape, and we needed to have the park be the centerpiece. It would be. He still has a loan to repay to his dad. He quits Central Park largely because he's being penny pinched a little bit by the people controlling the purse strings, and he's starting to feel micromanaged. He tries to quit a couple times, and then he finally decides he's going to take the plunge, and he becomes the head of the Sanitary Commission for the Civil War effort. And then when he gets done with that, he gets an offer to run a gold mine in California for $10,000 a year. And because he owes Dad so much money, that sounds pretty good to him. But when he's out there, the gold mine starts failing, but he sees something even grander than the opportunity to pay back his dad. He goes and sees the Mariposa Grove for the first time. He sees the giant sequoias, and he's absolutely incredulous at what he sees. He's writing letters back to his father saying, this place is incredible, it needs to be saved. When he gets back from the Mariposa and he's going back to the mine, which is failing, he's going through horrible bouts of depression. He knows he's able to pay back his dad, but he's unsure of what he himself still has to offer the world. He's also just really wondering what the next direction for him is going to be in his life. He gets a telegram from a steamboat magnate in San Francisco saying that they've started a commission to see if Yosemite can be turned into a state park. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln signs the land over to become a state park. So Yosemite is going to become a park, but they need a management plan. They become aware that Olmsted is in the neighborhood, so they ask him to write the report for managing Yosemite. This is 1864. In the report, the Mariposa report, he writes a passage about why we need scenery. It is a scientific fact that the occasional contemplation of natural scenes of an impressive character, particularly if it occurs in connection with relief from ordinary cares, is favorable to health and vigor, especially that of their intellect beyond any other conditions which can be offered to them. The idea that you can visit nature and be restored is something that not only benefits you at the time you're in nature, but it also brings a subsequent capacity to have that effect again upon you. When you go revisit, you understand that the happiness and the means of securing it is always there. And then interestingly, he says, look what happens if you don't have access to nature. Some of the things you might get are mental disability, softening of the brain, paralysis, monomania, insanity. We cannot afford to take nature away from people. And so unlike Central Park, where he's talking about bringing nature to people, now he's talking about bringing people to nature. And he's hyper aware that very few people have seen Yosemite at this point in time, but there will come a time when that won't be so. In fact, he turns to one of his commissioners and says, someday there will be 3 million people a year visiting this place, which to most was an absurd thought, and it ended up being last year 3.5 million people went to Yosemite. The tragedy of the report that he wrote is that he was talking about designing a park that would minimize human effect on the landscape with things like carriage paths with scenic overlooks so that people would not be going in and ruining the best parts of the park by trampling it. But the report was largely ignored because 2 of the people that were on the commission with him were also on competing commissions and were afraid that if this one passed, their money would get yanked away by the state, so they kind of undermined his whole report. But it wasn't for naught. His son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., found the report and would later on use it to craft the mission statement of the National Park Service, which is about restoring landscape for the benefit of all. So after Mariposa goes belly up, he's adrift again. He's going through this period of melancholy. He's not even sure he wants to be involved with parks at all anymore. He's thinking about investing in oil, but he gets a job for the short term designing a cemetery for the city of Oakland, California. All this time, Calvert Vaux is trying to get him back into designing parks again, and he's pushing him off, saying that his health isn't great, Olmsted's health isn't great, and he doesn't really know if he wants to do it. And finally, he's looking down the road, and he's always looking for something better and bigger, and he says, I've all my life been considering distant effects and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future. He knows the future holds something great for him. He's unsure what it might be. And then finally, Vaux writes to him and says, here is the opportunity to come back and work with me. I've got this job designing Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Will you come out and join me as a partner again? And that's what flipped the switch again for Olmsted. He worked with Vaux for 7 years and became his great friend for another 30. So now for the baton pass to Gifford Pinchot. To talk about Gifford, you need to talk about his father, James, who was largely responsible for him taking the path to forestry that he took. So unlike Olmsted, who was more affected by what he saw, Gifford Pinchot was more affected by what he learned from his father. So the Pinchot family came from France to the U.S. and arrived in Milford, Pennsylvania in 1819, where James's father, Gifford's grandfather, purchased 400 acres of land and immediately set about clear-cutting it. They made most of their money through lumbering. They operated a small store in town, which brought them some prominence. But James had this idea that he was going to go make it on his own. He did not want to enter the family lumbering business. Instead, he went to New York City. From New York City, it grew from $500,000 to about 814,000 in the decade from 1850 to 1860, and this is where James Pinchot made his fortune. He started importing wallpaper from France and window treatments. And talk about good timing for that. Not only was New York booming from a personal, people buying homes and suburbia, whatnot, but hotels were really his big impetus for making money. So these big hotels, the Astoria and others, were popping up, and he was making tons of money from selling them window treatments, the first Bed Bath & Beyond. He made $4 million selling wallpaper. He was always socially connected and socially focused. He was very invested in bringing the Statue of Liberty to America, and he teamed up with Richard Morris Hunt, who designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. We see it taking shape here, and we see the grand finale there. Richard Morris Hunt of Bennington, Vermont, was becoming a famous architect. It would only become more so. Pinchot took his $4 million and decided to build a summer residence in Milford, Pennsylvania, and hired Richard Morris Hunt to do that as well. And you may also have seen his work at the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, the largest private residence ever built in the United States. So at the ripe young age of 44, James Pinchot retires and has Gray Towers commenced in Milford, Pennsylvania, 1886. Gifford's a young boy. Mary Jane Eno Pinchot, Gifford's mother, came from a well-to-do family as well, so they were not wanting. And they hired Frederick Law Olmsted in the perfect circle here to design the grounds of Gray Towers. How many people have been to Gray Towers? It's an amazing, amazing place. Please put it on your bucket list. It's just absolutely fabulous, Milford, Pennsylvania. So they hired Olmsted to do the grounds, complete with Gifford's own fly casting pool. It's an amazing place. So Gifford was 1 year old when they were building Gray Towers. It's the only place he knew growing up. James retired. he sets his sights on making a difference in America. One of the things that sort of predates what was happening in his mind, everything started coming to James at once, but the first thing was he knew firsthand that his family had had an effect on the landscape, right? They had clear-cut a great swath of it themselves. So just to give you the lay of the land, literally, this is how much virgin forest there was when the Pilgrims arrived. This is how much there was in the 1880s. And this is how much there was in the early 1900s. So the forests are being clear-cut largely, and the foresters are cutting and moving on. In many cases, particularly upstate New York, they're just leaving unpaid taxes in their wake. They're just continuing on to the next great forest, and we'll just keep going until we hit the West Coast. So he's aware, James is aware, but the second awakening for him comes with a book called Man and Nature, written by George Perkins Marsh. Marsh was born and raised in Vermont, and also an area of tremendous clear cutting, and started realizing what an effect this was having on the environment. The streams were being filled with silt, or they were drying up. They were either landslides or floods. He was really profoundly aware of man's effect, and he wrote this book in 1864, and he's talking about, we have now felled forest enough everywhere, in many districts far too much. Let us restore this one element of material life to its normal proportions, and devise means for maintaining the permanence of its relations to the fields, the meadows, and the pastures. He's making a call for those who care to start paying attention and re-landscaping if possible. It had a great effect on James, and one of the most profound statements in the book for him was, the improvement of forest trees is the work of centuries, so much more the reason for beginning now. So he knows that there's a sense of urgency, and he thinks that maybe his son is the right one to do it. He's also aware that it's not just trees that are being wiped out in vast quantities. The buffalo, of course, the bison are being wiped out, and so are many of the birds. And of course, his personal family has had their own effect. So he reads Man and Nature, and he and his wife Mary decide that for his 21st birthday, Gifford should have a signed copy of Man and Nature for him to understand that maybe forestry is the way to go. As he enters Yale, his father says, how would you like to become a forester? And Pinchot, quite famously in his biography, says, I didn't really know what to say because I really didn't know what it was. There really was no forestry in America. And he said, what a profound question for his father to ask. He didn't realize until many, many decades later, when he realized that he had set him on a life-altering course. When he arrives at Yale, he tells his classmates he's going to become a forester, and that forestry will become his life work. Of course, they don't know what forestry is either. There he is in Yale. And he's assured by his professors that there's no such thing as a forestry degree in America. And when he's told this, he writes a letter home to his father and says, basically, this is awesome. I will not only have no competitors, but I will have a science to found. Gifford is never one to be turned back by anything in his wake, believe me. So his father helped send him to France. He studies in France and Germany and learns from the best, the foresters in France and Germany. He learns about sustainable forestry and selective harvesting for the first time, and the idea of succession planting. So he comes back and he says, great, I'm here to start a new profession and set the world on fire, metaphorically. And guess what? No one's interested. America's not ready to hear what he has to say or do. And so he sort of gives up on trying to ply the halls of Congress and ends up taking a job out west, sort of surveying out there. He's writing articles trying to get people to understand the benefits and need of forestry, but he's not really having much luck, so he bums around out west for a while, paying jobs but not paying much. But enter Olmsted. So Olmsted in 1888 gets summoned by George Vanderbilt to what is going to become the Biltmore Estate in Asheville. And he looks around, and Vanderbilt has purchased a big chunk of land. Much of it has been clear cut. And Olmsted immediately sees the potential for restoring the land and managing it for production, which is a brand new idea as far as Vanderbilt is concerned. But he says, you have an opportunity to show that sustainable forestry is actually money-making forestry. And I know just the young man to do it. There's over 86,000 acres of forest to be managed, and Olmsted has no interest in doing it. He has all these gardens and grounds to design around the Biltmore Estate. So he says, you know, James Pinchot's young son, Gifford, might be just the man to do it. So this was really Pinchot's first job in managing forests, and he was out to prove the viability of managing them for everyone's benefit. So there are two common themes in Pinchot's life in terms of building consensus. One is getting the word out, building the need from the ground up, and the second one was playing the political game with those who he needed to try to gain consensus with on the federal level. First, the American people needed to understand what was at stake. He wrote many articles in things like Garden and Forest magazine, which was the preeminent gardening magazine at the time. I can't believe I didn't catch that typo. It should say needed to understand. And from the very beginning, he had always said that his job was not to stop the axe, but to manage its use. And he was always steadfast about that from the very beginning. And when he talked to anyone in the forestry profession or anyone who was in forestry, who was at the time cutting trees out west, for example, he would make that statement. He wanted them to understand he was not there to put them out of business. He was, in fact, there to help them run a better business. If they kept doing what they were doing, they weren't going to have a business. He was so prolific in writing that if you walked into the Library of Congress, you would see that the largest collection of any in the whole Library of Congress is the Gifford Pinchot collection. He wrote a ton, and people wrote to him. The second part was forging alliances. He was doing this very early on with his father's encouragement, but he became a confidant of TR very early. When Roosevelt was governor of New York, in fact, he was consulting with him and advising him on how to better manage the forests of New York. And then when TR became vice president, it was all queued up to be making speeches about the importance of establishing national forests and preserves. So that worked out pretty well. And it was an alliance that continued throughout their lives. Pinchot was a great proponent of the idea that his father instilled in him, of the idea of using America's lands and public lands for the greatest good. The greatest good for the greatest number over the long haul became his mantra. And it was the way he felt that it was a question of public trust. We should all benefit from public lands. He had an inexhaustible drive to make the national forests a reality. It took years and years. He worked on a number of commissions to try to make it so. And he traveled, he saw the forests and the trees literally, personally, by taking train rides and horseback rides all throughout the country. In fact, he met John Muir on a trip out west, and they went to the Grand Canyon, spent a night on the rim of the Grand Canyon together, which is interesting because of their differing points of view in preservation versus conservation. In 1898, he was finally named chief of the forestry division. He was afraid that it was not going to be for long because Congress was trying to make him make the case that the forestry division would be a profitable entity, or even an entity that was worthwhile. Up until that time, the forestry division was an advice dispensing organization. They did not manage any forests at all. The forests were managed in another division, and so he didn't have any power to regulate anything. All he could say was, this is how we think the forest should be run. The Department of the Interior controlled all the existing land, and Pinchot was in agriculture. And so Congress was demanding proof of worth. So he decides, I don't think I can't really prove my worth because I'm not the head of any federal lands, but what I can do is become an advocate and to show private landowners how to best utilize their forests. So that's what he did. And he published a circular called Number 21 to help farmers, lumbermen, and other private landowners make working plans for managing their forests. And boy, did he hit a home run. In 1 year, lumber companies, farmers, and woodlot owners in 35 states were calling on the services. Over 1.5 million acres of privately managed forests were now being managed due to the input of Pinchot and his minions. So in 1904, the inflection point comes. He's still not in charge of anything really per se, and he decides that the only way to get control of the forest is to have a conference and get all the players at the table. So he wanted everyone there, both people working within the government, but also, importantly, timber, railroad, livestock, mining interests, anybody, even people from agencies that felt threatened by what he was proposing. Please come to the conference and learn and talk among each other to try to gain consensus on how all this can happen. It was a wild success. He said that the most important thing was the new recruits that were won over. And only 26 days after the conference ended, Roosevelt received the bill from Congress and signed it into law, which all of a sudden, finally, all of a sudden, I say, after years and years, 86 million acres of forest reserves were now under Pinchot's department's control. Now he needed to hire the right people to take care of it and give them the tools for doing it. Here's Aldo Leopold as a young forester with his horse, set loose as a 21-year-old young man to tell the lumber people out there that there were going to be different laws about, different rules about managing the land. So it was about hiring the right people and giving them the right tools to do the job. So the first thing Pinchot did when he got control of the forest was spent 6 months with some of his young reports writing a manual for how to perform in the field called the Use Book. It standardized policy and it provided guidance for professional behavior to help these young recruits become proficient and successful in the field. And he garnered an incredible amount of loyalty from his department heads and his employees. They were fired with a determination to do the utmost to move forward his cause of conservation in the United States. And I also love this one from one of his first hires. All of us who followed Pinchot were so impressed by what he stood for that we would follow him through fire and flood. Whatever he said, we were going to implement, and we were going to be the best we could be. And then finally, on Pinchot, winning them over was not just an exercise of having a conference and inviting people to it. It was actually winning people over in the field. And he was sent out to a conference out west, a very rough assignment that Roosevelt, as president, sent him to go and take care of in 1907 at the Public Lands Convention in Denver. He sat through 2 days of being vilified by different speakers at the podium and sat there taking hits, metaphorical hits to the chin. And then finally, when it was his time to speak, he was introduced as the meanest individual on earth and walked through this hall of people and walked up to the lecture podium and said, if you fellows can stand by me, I can stand by you. And by the time he got done, he was assuring the crowd that everyone, including small-scale ranchers, would receive their proper due without fear of favoritism and graft. And he emphasized the importance of the science of forestry in maintaining their careers, regulating grasslands, protecting watersheds, and in fact, ensuring the viability of their profession, not just for them, not just for the markets, but for their own children and grandchildren. And when he left the podium, one reporter said, the crowd cheered lustfully. So again, he walked into the fire and addressed it head on and won the respect of a large number, if not all. And I wanted to mention an often overlooked champion in the cause was Gifford Pinchot's wife, Cornelia Bryce Pinchot, who Theodore Roosevelt called her her political mind, one of the keenest he had ever known. She was really brilliant, and she was an advocate also for bringing many parties to the table. She encouraged women to take an active part in politics and career. And as I said, she was a proponent of understanding all points of view. They would have parties at Gray Towers, and she insisted on bringing people to the table, quite literally, to the table with differing points of view to talk over points of the day, which were often could be contentious, but ask them to break bread together and figure out a way forward, which was quite groundbreaking at the time. And part of her effort to do this, she discovered early on that when she tried to bring people with differing points of view, they tended to congregate together rather than interact the way she would like them to. So she came up with an idea called the finger bowl. Too often like-minded guests were mingling, so she came up with this idea. She designed a dinner table that was actually a pool. This is a picture of it here. So around the edge, you could put place settings, but in the middle was water. And the way that she designed it was people would pass food in a wooden bowl. So you'd have to ask someone across the table to pass the food to them by pushing a food bowl across. And her whole idea was to start this intermingling in a physical as well as a meaningful way. It's a pretty neat thing to see. This is a great pergola over the top too. It's really a neat place to be. It's right outside Gifford's office. So now the final baton pass that is to the young foresters that started the Wilderness Society. So what was happening was there were a number of the young foresters, Aldo Leopold, Benton Mackay, and others, who were really upset at the fact that cars were starting to literally make inroads into areas that they felt should be sacrosanct. And the rise of the automobile was unprecedented. And Benton Mackay, who came up with the idea for the Appalachian Trail in 1921, was writing, one function at least of true wilderness is to provide a refuge from the crassitudes of civilization, whether visible, intangible, audible, whether the billboard of pavement of auto horn. All of these are urban essences. All of them are negations of the wilderness. So it was the car, that more than anything, that was causing a negative effect on the wilderness. and to the extent that there was any remaining. Literally, the growth of the automobile went in 1910 from around 3% of the households to, when we're talking in the 1930s, we're closing in on 50%. And what that was doing was road building was becoming a major occupation, a major driver, literally, of cars into places that had been rural before. And with the help of the Forest Service and the Park Service, I should add, roads were becoming the way for people to escape urban and go to rural, but we were also seeing a proliferation of skyline drives. And not only skyline drive, as is seen here in Northern Virginia, which, oh, by the way, was literally laid down over 34 miles of the Appalachian Trail. So you literally had a road going over a trail that was invented to get away from it all. You also had 11 other skyline drives being proposed. As wild as it seems now, there was one proposed over the Green Mountains in Vermont, over the whole length of Vermont, over the White Mountains in New Hampshire, over the Massanutten Range in Virginia, another one in Georgia. There were 12 in all that were being proposed. And the fellows that were aware of this were scared to death and decided that they maybe should do something about it. So there was a guy who was a secretary for the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club that wrote a note to Benton MacKaye saying we should start an organization that comes out against skyline drives. And so Benton, who's seen here in the upper left, he was headed toward a forestry convention in Tennessee, and there he met Harvey Broom, who was the only non-forester of them, but he was a great proponent of the Smoky Mountains. Bernard Frank was a forester, and of course Bob Marshall was. So they all went to this conference together, the American Forestry Association meeting. And Broom's wife was driving the car on their way to see a demonstration forest, and the four of these guys started talking in such animated form that Harvey Broom's wife finally pulled the car aside and said, "This isn't safe. You guys need to get out of the car and solve this issue." So on the side of the road in Tennessee, they put together this idea of being against skyline drives. And Bob Marshall said, famously, we shouldn't start an organization which is against anything. We should start an organization that is for something. And so they decided to get together and call this organization the Wilderness Society. So among the 8 original members, as I mentioned many times, Aldo Leopold, who many of us know for writing a Sand County Almanac, one of the greatest conservation books ever. Bob Marshall, who died way too young, and wrote The Problem of Wilderness in 1938, which was one of the first calls for wilderness areas. And Benton MacKaye, the father of the Appalachian Trail, they were among the first 3 of the Wilderness Society. So after 2 decades of fits and starts and being involved in projects of their own, Bob Marshall dies at age 38, way too young. Robert Sterling Yard, who was their publicist, died in his 80s. And other founders, as I said, were too involved in their own projects to move things forward. And so Benton MacKaye became the president in 1945 at age 66. And there he is smoking his pipe. And he becomes the head of the organization. Benton knew a lot about why we needed wilderness. He wasn't the greatest one to communicate the message. He was, to put it kindly, he was very academic in the way he spoke. So he knew what he wanted to say, but he would often say to people, I wish you would write this so it would be clearer, and get to the point faster. He was more of the sort of academic journal type. And so they were looking for somebody, they needed somebody desperately to make the connection of why wilderness areas were important. and they found him in a fellow named Howard Zahniser, whose son, I am thrilled, is here in the audience tonight, Ed. Howard was an absolutely gifted communicator. He was exactly what was needed, even though some of the founders were concerned that he didn't look like a wilderness man. He was absolutely the right person for the job. In 1947, Mackay was proposing to the Wilderness Society Council that they focus their entire mission on securing a nationwide system of wilderness areas protected by statutory law. And Howard was the one who really put this thing on his back and carried it to the goal line. It's an extraordinary achievement. And as a common theme here, as we saw with Pinchot, Zahniser did not see opponents as enemies. He really wanted to understand other people's points of view and bring them into the conversation. He felt that they needed to be reconciled, and did so, and how. 19 congressional hearings, 60 rewrites, if not more, scores of meetings, writing articles, finding support wherever he could, and even to the point where he had this coat specially designed for him with several pockets inside that he could carry different versions of talking points in his jacket, so when he met members of Congress, he could pull out the right one and hand it to them so that they would also become advocates for the bill. And as Ed would attest, it was a heavy coat to lift at the end of the day. He would also carry an occasional book in there like Dante or Thoreau. But collaboration was key to Howard, and he said, I think this is just a wonderful quote, "It has long been my opinion that wilderness preservation policies will not be firmly established and secure until those who might wish to make a conflicting use of our wilderness areas have joined in developing the policies, and having done so are satisfied to accept them." His fear, and I think it was obviously founded, was if the people aren't brought to the table to be part of the solution, then they'll probably work to undermine it in the end. Brilliant. Out of the wilderness has come the substance of our culture, and with a living wilderness, it is our faith that we will also have a vibrant, vital culture and an enduring civilization of healthful, happy people who will perpetually renew themselves in contact with the earth. Amen. Unfortunately, Howard did not live to see the law signed, although he did know that it was headed for passage. He died in his sleep in May of 1864, but the full House passed 374-1, which was just an amazing achievement and a testament to everything that Howard brought to the table as a person and his tactics as well. Brilliant and endearing man and champion of the wilderness who's often underestimated. Signed into law here with his wife Alice looking on and LBJ signing. And the immediate effect of the Wilderness Act was over 9 million acres in 13 states, including the 3 that you see here. And today the Wilderness Act has grown to include nearly 112 million acres, including parts of national parks and forests, wildlife refuges, and BLM lands. So today, as a culmination of this 100-year-plus journey, we have 423 national parks, 803 wilderness areas, and 154 national forests, plus another 20 grasslands. It was an incredible achievement led by the 3 people highlighted tonight and scores of others who I wove into my book who were making the clarion call early on and sounding the alarm and slowly helping to build consensus for what the others were able to bring to fruition in all the areas we so enjoy today. As was mentioned, if you haven't checked the book out, it's out front. I was able to sign a few, thank you, already. There's more about the lives of Olmsted and Pinchot, of course, in it, more about the creation of national forests, the political and economic realities they were facing when they were trying to bring all of this to fruition, and the concept of preservation and conservation and how that's changed, and how some are starting to work toward making both happen on the same property. There can be room for both. And my book is 28 after tax, I think. Here I am at Gray Towers speaking. One of the New Yorker cartoonists was kind enough to do a rendering of me there doing a talk. You can always check my website for more virtual and in-person events, jeffryanauthor.com. There's some business cards out back if you don't want to forget. And thank you so much for having me tonight. It's been an honor. Thank you.
So thank you for tuning in. I'm Mark Madison, the historian for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm with Jeffrey Ryan, author of a brand new book, This Land Was Saved for You and Me, a wonderful book.
Thank you,
Thanks
Mark.
for sharing. It just came out in September.
September 1st.
That's wonderful. This is something new we're trying. In addition to doing a public lecture this evening, which we're very excited about to kind of kick off the new book, we're actually adding a little bonus content for those of you that watch it online to learn a little more about the author, in this case, Jeffrey, who's very, very interesting. In addition to this book, I think the first time we had you out here, Jeff, was about the Appalachian Trail. You have an interesting way of researching your books. It's kind of go there and then write about it.
Right. I feel really strongly about the experiential part of writing about my subjects. So in the case of the Appalachian Trail, I spent 28 years hiking it with the same friend, and I think it just really gives you an appreciation. In particular, in that case, I developed and refined an appreciation for being outdoors, which I always had. But I also started really developing an appreciation for the people that made our public lands possible. We wouldn't have those landscapes to enjoy if it weren't for the people who came before us, and the people who have picked up the baton to make sure that they stay vibrant and protected.
One of the interesting things about you, besides the fact you spent 28 years researching a book, which is probably a Guinness record, is you describe yourself as a storyteller. And that is not hype. I just stumbled across your website looking for an image and came across a marvelous story I'd forgotten that was in your Benton Mackay book. Tell us briefly the connection between the World's Fair, Dvorak, and the Appalachian Trail. This is one of my favorite conservation history moments ever.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I think what I've found is the more I dive into conservation history, the more I find this amazing web of threads that connects people that you would never even imagine connecting. And in the case of the World's Fair and Dvorak and the Appalachian Trail, it turns out that the father of the Appalachian Trail, Benton Mackay, his father was a phenomenal talent in the realm of theater. He was not only a tremendous playwright, but he also patented, I think it was 17 things that were related to movie theaters, including one that stays with us today, the folding theater seat,
Really?
which he designed so that people could escape a theater in case of a fire, which was a real threat back then when they had gas lamps lighting the stage. And so Mackay's father came up with this idea to build the largest theater in the history of the world for the World's Fair in 1893 in Chicago, and got $800,000+ in funding from people like Pullman of the Pullman Car Company, and put the money to use to start building this giant theater. And he hired Dvorak to write the score for the play that he was going to have in the theater, which, oh, by the way, was going to have an 8-foot deep stage floating life-size replicas of the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria. And so this whole thing was absurd in its scale. And what ended up happening was there was a financial panic. There were a bunch of other problems. The financiers started pulling money away from the project, and it only ever ended up being 1/3 built. The symphony was only partially completed when Dvorak left and went to New York. And when people from the New York Philharmonic heard parts of it, they said, "This is fantastic, you need to finish it." And it ended up being what we now know as Symphony Number 9, the New World Symphony.
That's the most famous one.
the best
staple.
symphony ever. And so they all kind of intersected there. And sadly, Mackay's father died basically of shame only months after the failure of his theater, which he felt was such a colossal failure. And as a direct line to Mackay, young Mackay, he ended up spending a lot of time in the outdoors healing from that event of losing his father at age 14. And so I really believe that event and the fallout from it helped him become the person that he became, the great proponent of spending time in the outdoors.
And you wrote a great biography of Mackay and his conflict.
Yeah, Mackay's a hero of mine because he did so many things, and like another hero in my book, Frederick Olmsted, had such a varied life, which culminated in protecting wilderness areas. Both of them had really amazing upbringings with a lot of fits and starts and careers in public service and for public service and just wonderful legacies.
You also are interesting in that you travel to a lot of different places to get a sense of the context of some of these conservation pioneers you look at. What does that add to your history?
It adds a lot. As we mentioned before, a sense of place is really important to me. And what I'm really interested in is about the intersection of what made these people who they are, how much was spending time in the outdoors an influence, how much was their parental guidance or adult guidance part of that narrative. And going there and experiencing that is really important to me to be able to tell the story in a way that resonates. It has to really resonate with me first before I can tell it effectively or persuasively to an audience. So it's interesting because in the case of Olmsted, he was really taken by scenery. It was the number one thing he remembers from being a child. And the importance of scenery to him really laid out everything in terms of how he designed parks, like Central Park, but also how he felt about Yosemite when he saw it the first time. So in the case of Central Park, he was bringing nature to people that were already there. In the case of Yosemite, he realized that the people weren't there yet, but he had to make sure that the nature was protected so that when they got there, it wouldn't be trampled, which was an amazing insight to have in 1864.
Yeah, we don't usually think of Olmsted as a conservationist, more as a urban designer and so on.
Right. So he felt really strongly about both Yosemite and Niagara Falls, which is another really interesting example because he saw Niagara Falls as a child and went back and saw a number of hot dog stands and sort of a Coney Island atmosphere there, and he was really affected by that. Astounded is a better word, and helped make sure that the place was not only preserved what hadn't been sort of affected already by mankind, but also saw that some of those businesses were taken out so that the view was put back in play again.
So this book looks at a century of folks from Olmsted through Howard Zahniser, and there's, I think, 7 characters
Right.
you looked at. What intrigues you about telling history through biography? How did you pick these 7?
Boy, it's the threads again. I started following the thread, and I was really actually surprised because I was going to start with Pinchot, but Pinchot was handed the baton from Olmsted. So I started digging more into Olmsted and was really amazed, like I believe, I hope most people are, that thought that he was an urban park designer, which largely he was. But it was all about the scenery, and it was about how meaningful nature, being in nature, was for everyone. And so it was he who hired Pinchot to manage the forest at Biltmore and started the whole forestry movement, arguably. So, and to show the viability of forestry as a profession. So that when I started following those threads along, I also started looking into what about other people that were making the call for preservation, but their voices weren't being heard yet. So I started weaving them into the story too, because often they're overlooked. There were fits and starts of the movement toward preserving and conserving more land. And it took these big movers and shakers to actually make it happen. But they couldn't have done it if those people weren't building making the salad or however you want to put it, preparing the food for the great feast. If that wasn't happening, they wouldn't have gotten where they were going. It was not something they could have done themselves. So as I started building that narrative, it all sort of fell into place. I started with what I thought was going to be a conservation family tree and found out that it was so complex that it was beyond my pay grade, or I refer to it in my lecture as Spock playing three-dimensional chess, that I could not make it quite work as well as I could if it was a linear event. So
it's a nice, tight book.
Thank you. Thank you.
and a good introduction to all of these. I wonder did any of these 7 characters particularly resonate with you?
Well, as I mentioned, Benton has been a big hero of mine all the way through, and because he was a forester himself, he understood the basic principles of forestry, but he was also the founder of the Appalachian Trail, and then switched gears and became one of the founders of the Wilderness Society. And so he basically lived through that progression that sort of sets the backbone of my book. So Benton's a big one. Aldo Leopold, of course, is also an amazing person that way, who basically founded the whole concept of game management and was dabbling in watershed restoration and ultimately prairie restoration, and also became one of the founders of the wilderness movement. So they're disparate characters, and how they all got there is really interesting to me. Different parts of the country, different upbringings, all arriving at the same place.
Well, and you have an interesting subtitle about how a band of foresters rescued America's public lands. Is there something about forestry in this period that particularly inclined people towards conservation? Because people forget
Yes.
Leopold was trained as a forester, worked for the Forest Service, and so on.
Right. Well, I think the first thing is that Pinchot taught and was adamant about the fact that his job was not to put foresters out of business. There was a great fear that whatever he was up to was basically anti-forestry, and that was not the question. The question was, how do we manage the resource for the benefit of all of us? And so that lesson resonated with all the young foresters that he hired. I think what they saw was that forest management was viable and necessary, but there was also something else necessary, which was making sure that at least some of our lands weren't forested and that they were left untrammeled by man, as Howard Zahniser put it. And I think that the great takeaway for this book is that, for me, is that all those pieces, all those parts of the public lands need to be created and protected, because urban people need parks to go to. We need splendorous places like the national parks to go to. We need forests to be viable for all of us, economically and for our own well-being. But then the final part of it is wilderness, and just leaving places alone is also important for us as people and for the planet. So there are great reasons for all of them, and it's a great thing that all of these people came along to make it so. Now it's our turn.
Yep. Well, you're not just an author and historian, but you've also done outreach, and you've made at least 2 videos on conservation heroes, on Aldo Leopold and Howard Zahniser. What was the purpose of those?
I really have a fascination for the founders of the Wilderness Society and deep appreciation for them. And they're all characters. Every one of them is an amazing person. And so I just started delving into looking into each one of them one at a time. And I'm working on the Ernest Oberholzer film, even as we speak, which is starting to come into form. So I really want to help not only honor their contributions, but help get them back into the spotlight any way I can. All very committed people and interesting people, worth visiting again.
The videos are wonderful.
Thank you.
And where can you find them, Jeff?
You can find the videos on my website called voicesofthewilderness.com. That's a good place to check them out, and more will be forthcoming.
Great. And the last fun thing about you, I'm sure you have many other fun things, but that I know is you alluded to, you're an avid hiker. And actually one of the fun things on your website was what to do if you get off the trail. And it's kind of interesting, as I was reading it, some of your tips actually apply to life. Get off
funny
the
how
trail.
that happens.
I know. Would you want to share a tip or two for some of our hikers in the audience if they lose track of the trail?
Sure, absolutely. My biggest thing about being in the out of doors is you're there to have fun, but don't forget you still have a job to do, which is
Right.
stay aware of your surroundings and what's going on. And I believe that the best way to make sure that you come back in safe and sound in one piece is to keep track of a few things all the time. And it's not that you have to slavishly be hyper aware of these things, but have them in your consciousness. And so I always think to myself, how's the water situation? How's my mental state? How's my physical state? Where's the next water? And where is my buddy? I haven't seen him in a while. Maybe I should stop. And then the last one is, when was the last time I saw a blaze?
Yeah.
Marking where the trail is. And I think the number one reason any of us get lost is we lose that consciousness. It's, I'm walking along on a path and it's still a path, and all of a sudden I look up and I'm not sure it's the path I'm supposed to be on. And that's the time to stop and retrace your steps, and don't panic, and just sort of recalibrate, and then get back to what you were doing. And that does apply to life.
It does. The other
Don't keep running.
the other lesson you had that resonated with me that applies to life is if you get lost, the tendency is to walk downhill because it's
Right.
easier.
Yes.
The trail you're supposed to be on
Is
might
usually
be uphill.
going up, right. So go back to where you came from, right. The easy way out always gets you in trouble, which is probably another great
That's a
life
metaphor
lesson.
too. Well, Jeff, this has been really fun.
Thank you.
And I've enjoyed all of your books, and I really enjoyed this last one. This Land Was Made for You and Me. So thank you for coming out to do the public lecture. Thank you for doing this little extra content for the online visitors. And The last thing I forgot to mention is Jeff has actually been to NCTC 3 times to speak, more than any other speaker. He holds the record, and we hope to get you out here a 4th time too.
Yeah, I need to set the goal, set the bar.
You set the bar high. Well, thank you, Jeff.
Keep writing, everyone. Maybe you'll catch up. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for tuning in.
Bye-bye.